Much for having us. Thanks for having us, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today on what's a really beautiful sunny afternoon here in Washington, D.C. Alex and I are at Ford's Theater, right in downtown Washington, which of course is the site of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. And we were just having a meeting with our Park Service partners talking about sort of the rise in interest in our site because there's an Apple TV series out right now called Manhunt, which is based on a book by one of our advisors, James Swanson. So it's been fun because there's been a lot of renewed interest. Um, but today we're actually going to talk, of course, about Lincoln, and we're going to focus on conflict and compromise, and kind of look at some of the decisions that he had sort of decisions and also steps that he had to take during the Civil War, sometimes in conflict with his direct ideas and thoughts, um, in order to sort of move the country forward. So we're going to pay close attention to his collaborations with the man on the left, Frederick Douglass, and we're going to see how these two leaders came into tension, some of Lincoln's political strategy, and how ultimately their actions together worked to end slavery and further the Union cause. We'll um, we'll take a look at the Emancipation Proclamation and talk about when and why it was issued, and specifically what it did. And I know in the great state of Kentucky, I live in the great state of Maryland, both border states. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, as we all know, excluded the border states. So that was certainly an example of compromise right there. And then we'll talk about, following the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass and Lincoln and their work to establish a unit of Black soldiers known as the United States Colored Troops.
All right. Sorry, I had to find my mute button. So sort of our quotable quote, especially for you all. I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Lincoln supposedly said this in 1861, so right at the beginning of the war. But Lincoln's views on slavery evolved over the course of the Civil War, and maybe not his personal views, because we know that Lincoln believed and knew slavery to be a moral wrong, and he was opposed to slavery on a personal level his entire life. But his political views, his professional views, and his notion of what he, as an elected official, had the power to do about slavery in his home state, in his country, that evolved over the course of the Civil War. So, um, early on in Lincoln's political career, we see him, I mean, he is part of this new Republican Party in the election of 1860. It is an anti-slavery platform, but he talks a lot in many of his speeches about maintaining slavery status quo, right? He says, I'm not going to touch it where it is. I just don't want it to expand. So he's not an abolitionist. He's not advocating for immediate and wide reaching um, end of slavery in the country. And he's taking this really moderate approach. And then Lincoln also really uh, articulates that he believes that he's bound by the existing laws. So, as president of the United States, he is bound by the Constitution and the powers granted to the executive branch therein. He believes that states have a tremendous amount of power. And so he spends a lot of time advocating for legislation that puts the onus on the states to end slavery at the state level rather than him doing it on the federal level. And he's also really cognizant of the limits of his executive power, right? He's elected to represent this wide and diverse nation. He, again, in his first inaugural address, he talks about how he's just not going to touch slavery. He just wants to prevent war. But by the end of the Civil War, he completely changes his tune, right? Slavery is abolished. He comes out publicly in support of granting the vote to African American men. And we see over the course of the war, Lincoln has actually tremendously expanded executive power, in this sort of unprecedented way, which is part and parcel of being part of this unprecedented period of American history. There were a lot of P's in that sentence, very alliterative. Anyway, so Lincoln starts out president in 1861, feeling very confined by the limitations of his power. And he really focuses on encouraging the states to do something about slavery. And he also looks at opportunities for incentivizing the states, right? So he's really seeking these like legal solutions that might be sort of ethically dubious. So one of the things he really supports is this idea of compensated emancipation, which pays enslavers for surrendering, giving up, emancipating their property, right? So he's using federal money to pay people for giving up the individuals that they own. But again, compensating them for this loss of property. He feels really confined by the existing fugitive slave laws, right? So at the start of the Civil War, if African Americans are seeking freedom and flee into free states, there are laws in place insisting that they be captured and returned to enslavement. And of course, one of the first loopholes in the American Civil War that allowed United States soldiers to evade the fugitive slave law was classifying these freedom seekers as contraband of war. So I don't know if, I mean, certainly perhaps in some of our presentations, but there was this idea of grouping freedom seekers and calling them contraband. And then their camps, their refugee camps, their communities that they set up around Union forts and in Washington, D.C., and, sort of along those borders of Confederate and Union territory were called contraband camps. But that's very specifically this legalese negotiation to say, sure, we have the power to take contraband of war from the Confederacy and not return it to them. So by classifying these humans as things, still, right, there's this loophole to the fugitive slave law. So all of that's happening, right? So we see Lincoln and his generals kind of navigating the legal situation of slavery in the United States in that first 2 years of the Civil War. Okay, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. So in the first paragraph, it says all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States. I cut this sort of awkwardly. Shall be thenceforward, and forever free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. Okay, so this is very dense, but it actually highlights like four really important strategic points. And the Emancipation Proclamation is a military order. Lincoln justifies it as a military necessity, right? So he is acting as commander in chief when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, this is a way that he perceives that he has the power as president to just make this declaration for the nation. So the first thing, and this is probably the most familiar thing to all of us studying the Emancipation Proclamation, and particularly those of you all in the border states, but that all persons held as slaves within any state that's in rebellion, those persons are then thenceforward and forever free. So the freedom only happens for people who are in those states that are in rebellion. So that excludes the border states. So Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. What's the fourth one? I'm blanking.
Missouri.
Missouri. All right, thank you. So those states are in the Union. They are not in rebellion, and yet they all have slavery. So anyone who is enslaved in those states is still enslaved. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free them. This little part in there about being forever free is really important. And apparently, forever free was also something that one of Lincoln's secretaries, his Secretary of State, Edwin Seward, added and when they were passing the drafts around the cabinet. But this idea that it's not just free for now, it's free forever, right? That's really important. And it lays the foundation for the next steps of legalizing freedom and abolishing slavery. So it's really subtle. It just sort of slips it in there. But think about that promise of forever freedom. It's so important. And then the next 2 points are really interconnected, but he's saying that the federal government will recognize and maintain that freedom. So that's, again, that's sort of the military order. That is he as taking executive power to just declare this, that the federal government recognizes this freedom once it's seized, and that the government and the military, so the military component here is really important too, right? So the government and the military will take no acts to repress any efforts those freedom seekers make for their actual freedom. So that's really important too, right? So that is opening the door. It says freedom, forever freedom is promised. And if you can get to Union lines, the Union Army will protect you, will maintain your freedom, and will take no action to repress that freedom. So that's what's really significant about this, right? So it's this promise of freedom. The people who are enslaved in the Confederacy still have to take it with their own hands and go and get it. But if they can make it to Union lines, if they can make it to a Union encampment, if they can make it to a free state, their freedom will be protected and preserved. And nobody with any kind of federal authority will do anything to stop them. And that's really, really important. So we're going to dig into sort of the next ripple effect of this, which is the creation of the USCT with General Order 143. And all of that is really tucked in very neatly with these 4 sort of promises made in that one paragraph. Any questions so far? That was a lot of information in the first 13 minutes of our session together.
Yeah, at any point, feel free to, unless you're driving, feel free to use the chat box at any point.
Silence. Good. All right, feel free to interrupt us.
So as Alex was mentioning, that sort of classification of people as property in the slaveholding states, and since they're in rebellion against the United States government, that when they're seized, they're considered contraband, just like a cannon would be contraband, or a crate of rifles or something. And so as the Union Army pushes farther into the South, they're presented with this really sort of interesting problem. And Lincoln realizes pretty early on that this, what could be seen as sort of a problem, could quickly become a strength. And that is that the 4 million people who are being held in slavery in the southern states are highly motivated, as Alex was saying, to freedom, whether that was physically relocating or whether it was joining the United States Army to fight for their own freedom. So Lincoln's being advised by various members of his cabinet, other people who influenced him. And in early 1863, he writes to Andrew Johnson, quote, "The colored population is the great available yet unavailed of force for restoring the Union. The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers upon the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. And who doubts that we can present that sight, but if we take hold in earnest." So here's this situation where Lincoln now has the legal right through the Emancipation Proclamation to establish a unit of the Army. As Alex pointed out, early on, Lincoln was very dedicated to the Constitution and doing what was legally permissible for a president to do, what was in the Constitution. So now he has this legal right. And what we're looking at in this photo, actually the picture on the left, I believe, is Lincoln at Antietam. And then on the right, it is a sergeant in the United States Colored Troops. So they issue War Department General Order number 143, which establishes this unit of the Army. That was on May 22nd, 1863. So soon after emancipation. This is a inset of a photo of one of the units that we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But so ultimately, at first recruiting was sort of slow going. It was hard to get the word out. People didn't really understand how this was going to work. And so Lincoln actually had to rely on people. And we'll talk about how one of the people that he really relied on was Frederick Douglass. But just a little bit more about the USCT. So eventually, by the end of the war, through these recruitment efforts and sort of the growing awareness of the opportunity and the ability of these soldiers, eventually there would be 180,000 Black soldiers in the United States Army and another 19,000 in the Navy. 40,000 would die, 30,000 of those from disease. We'll see that the conditions often that the USCT were encamped in and the rations they were given and the equipment were often inferior to those given to white soldiers. But nevertheless, against all adversity, including a lot of doubt from white soldiers in the Union Army, they were able to establish themselves as very valiant and capable fighters, serving in places like Port Hudson in Louisiana. Of course, the famous scene in the movie Glory at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, Chaffin's Farm in Virginia, and elsewhere. And so they actually gained the respect of a lot of people who were sort of unsure in the beginning on whether or not these newly freed people could make good soldiers. And we'll see some of the recruiting efforts in just a second here. But as I mentioned, Lincoln really needs help, and he needs it badly. And so Frederick Douglass actually is visiting Washington, and he's calling on various government dignitaries, including the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And this is on August 10th, 1863. So just 3 months after the General Order number 143. And he actually gets an audience with Lincoln. And Lincoln knows who Douglass is because, of course, Douglass is he has his own newspaper, and he's a famous editor and an orator. And Lincoln actually reads some of the criticism that Douglass publishes in his paper. And so they're in the White House, and they meet, and they specifically talk about recruiting the USCT. And Douglass says, well, you know what, I can't do it unless we can sort of agree on 3 major points of how these soldiers will be treated. Because early on, if they've been taken prisoner, many times they were just executed. They weren't paid the same as white soldiers. They didn't have the same protections. And so at this point, Douglass has 2 sons who have just enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts, which was one of the first units of the United States Colored Troops. And so he actually, he has obviously a very invested interest in how these soldiers will be treated and protected. So the first thing that he discusses with Lincoln is the issue of prisoners of war. And what he says to Lincoln is that, hey, for every time a member of the USCT is taken prisoner by the Confederate Army and executed, you have to execute a Confederate prisoner. And Lincoln's like, wait a second, I support the sentiment behind what you're saying, but there's no way that the country would go for that right now. Then he talks about unequal pay. He says, Black soldiers are being paid $7 a month, white soldiers $10 a month. They need to be paid the same. And eventually that would happen. And then he also talks about promotions, specifically the lack of promotions that the black soldiers faced, namely that they couldn't become officers. So they could, be as high as the rank of sergeant. And Douglas was really pushing for that as well. So he's pushing for their sort of protection as well as their treatment and their ability to advance. And this is really the first example of a black man in the White House arguing for policy decisions. We have a primary source that we'd like to share with you that describes this trip to Washington that Frederick Douglass took.
So after Douglass did his round of meetings on August 10th that summer, he first met with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and then he goes to Lincoln. He writes this letter to a man named George Stearns, and he describes what it was like to meet these two people. So the first half of the letter is all about meeting Stanton, which is sort of entertaining if you're going in for a deep cut, right? Because he's like, Stanton was very gruff. And then he talks about meeting Lincoln. And in this letter, it's really extraordinary because he describes how Lincoln immediately put him at ease, how he at once understood why people called him Honest Abe. And he talks about how, Lincoln shook his hand and listened to him. And, in this letter, he's like, I don't need to go into all of the arguments that I made because you already know them. Remember, he's writing to his friend, George Stearns. But he talks about how Lincoln responds to what Douglass had, what he had to say to him. And he talks about how, or he recounts how Lincoln explained that he's having to deal with prejudices across the nation, right? Confronted with equal pay and with the treatment of prisoners of war, and that demand for a retaliatory action. So the retaliatory action was, for every Union prisoner of war that is mistreated, specifically African American Union prisoners of war, then a Confederate prisoner of war would also be executed or, made to serve hard labor, or, the eye for an eye thing, right? Lincoln resists doing this at first because he just knows that the racial prejudices in the country among the voting public, right, that they're going to be outraged that white and black people are being treated equally. And yet here you have Douglass saying, yeah, but that's the point. They need to be treated equally because they're fighting equally. They're sacrificing their lives equally, if not even more so, right? Because African American soldiers have that much more on the line. If they know that they're not going to be treated equally on the other side of this, then their sacrifice might even be that much greater. And so Lincoln sort of explains why he's resisted doing this, but then he ultimately concedes that yes, a retaliatory order has been issued. And so prisoners of war will be, comparably treated on either side so that there are some stakes for the Confederate soldiers who are mistreating their prisoners. But what's really interesting here, right, is so Douglass comes away from this meeting not satisfied, right? Because Lincoln doesn't say, yes, I hear you, we're going to fix it all right now, right? But rather, Lincoln explains the other factors that he's having to navigate. And so Douglass, as an advocate, an activist, he's recruiting those soldiers. He has his own sons in his heart and in his mind when he's advocating for these soldiers, right? He comes away from this meeting with Lincoln not totally satisfied, but then he says something really important, and that's I've highlighted here at the end. He says, my whole interview with the president was gratifying and did much to assure me that slavery would not survive the war and that the country would survive both slavery and the war. And I think that that's really extraordinary because when we talk about conflicting times, divided times, people with different ideas about how something should be dealt with, how something should be managed, increasingly divisive political rhetoric, right? We see these two men, we see Lincoln and Douglas go head to head. They have a shared goal, and the thing that they can come away from this meeting with an understanding is that they do share that same goal, right? Douglas trusts Lincoln's intentions at the end of this meeting, and he didn't going into it, which is sort of extraordinary. So even though they might disagree, there's gonna be some tension between the two of them on the how. They're working towards the same goal, and we see that in Douglas's own words, which is pretty cool. Okay.
All right. So let's take a minute here and talk about the difference, well, similarities and differences between elected officials and activists. Um, what are some considerations for each? And what are who? So let's type that in the chat box, or feel free to unmute. What what are differences between an elected official and an activist in terms of what they can do? And especially, think about this under the guise of conflict and compromise. Looks like someone's typing. I can see it. Okay, thank you, Lacey. Would an activist just have the right to speak? I'm really not sure. That's certainly a great point. Right, the activist certainly has the right to speak and can pretty much say whatever they want, right? Jennifer points out an activist may not be bound to compromise. That's interesting too. Right, because I mean, if you think about it, who elects the elected official? It's the people, right? And so the elected official um, is representing the people and has to do what the people want, whereas the activist can just be, you know, a sort of a lone wolf and just promote their own idea or their own cause. Right. And as Jennifer points out, if you're the activist, you don't have to compromise because you're speaking out for your cause.
I like what Kim put in the chat. They both typically want some kind of change, political or social. So that's why you're doing the work, right? That is something that they share.
In this case, Alex, what do you think both Lincoln and Douglas, specifically around this issue of the United States color troops, what do they want? I guess I'm not putting that question very well.
I got an answer though.
Okay,
Lacey says equal rights. Yeah.
nice.
I think, as they're both seeking to end slavery in the country, right? Both of them see military service as a means to that end. So Douglas, throughout the war, way before 1863, advocated for arming Black men. And he was saying, I mean, there's some fantastic speech where he says, once you get the eagle on their uniform and the letters US on their brass buttons and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, he like then this sort of catapult to citizenship, right? This recognition of someone's participation in society, in democracy here in the United States, right? This sort of ultimate like civic duty, right? Like that would cement African Americans sort of in American culture in a way that they hadn't been acknowledged up until this point, right? So Douglas is advocating for military service as a way to get African Americans recognized as citizens and to also let them fight for their own freedom, right? Like Frederick Douglass is advocating for folks to have their own agency and to utilize it, right? He's very adamant about that. And then, as we saw earlier, in that quote that Jake shared, right? Lincoln also sees this as a means to the same end, in that, again, if we see African American soldiers fighting bravely and with honor and nobly and disciplined and all of that, then that starts to dispel a lot of the prejudiced myths and ideas that are out there in the country. And it also helps the war effort because now we've got 200,000 more bodies fighting for the Union, right? That's a really like logistical advantage that Abraham Lincoln is really concerned about. And it shifts that power dynamic, right? So instead of having, I mean, there's still millions of essentially refugees, right? Even though that's a 20th century idea, the idea of a refugee, right? But like this, these freedom seekers who are uh, fleeing into Union lines, fleeing into free states, and then living in these contraband camps, right? Like to mobilize some of those people and have them join the army so that they continue to fight for freedom and fight to end slavery for all of those millions who are still trapped in bondage, right? Like we see that that argument works for both of them, but they're hitting it from different angles, right? We've got the sort of the advocate and the agency and the self-empowerment angle, but then we've got the like political and the um logistical, practical angle on the other side too.
Yeah. I think it can be as basic as, I think that they both wanted the US to win the Civil War, and they saw this establishment as a means to the end. Lincoln to preserve the Union, Douglas to end slavery and start the process of citizenship. So they were working together, ultimately for the same goal, I think, of winning the war. Let's take a look at some of the recruiting efforts and ways that these soldiers are portrayed, and consider maybe who the audience of some of these primary sources were that we'll take a look at. So the first one is a recruiting poster, and we see. Actually, let me ask you what you see. Type in the chat box. What do you see in this picture? What's one thing you see? And I will let you know that this is a recruiting poster. So these would have been displayed, probably in post offices and in towns and cities. And who might the audience for this be? Who are they trying to message here? Well, obviously, um, black men who might want to join the army, right? You can see that they in this poster. Yeah, thank you, Kim. The flag size is really significant, so you definitely see who you're serving. And then Brittany made a really astute observation that over on the left, we have a white officer who is in charge of these black men. So that very well could have been aimed at a white audience who might have been scared or apprehensive about arming black men. And this might have been a way of saying, well, hold on a second. Look who's still, look who's going to be keeping an eye on things and be in charge. Yeah, Lacey, I definitely agree. They look proud, and they have the white leader, and they look well equipped. They have neat, intact uniforms. Everyone's got the same thing. They all have shoes and boots, and so the message there could be like, you will be well taken care of in the army. And then I really like that comment about the flag, because the sort of the light is shining on the flag too, the way that the artist has used lighting. It's almost, the message is clear that the light is shining down on the United States.
One thing I just want to explain a little bit because when we use this image a lot, it with many of our programs, and at first glance, and particularly the specific file that we have to show you right now, right? At first glance, we've had folks look at it and be like, are they wearing gray uniforms? Because they look gray, and isn't the gray the Confederacy? And why would they be wearing gray uniforms? And so I think over time, the sort of authenticity of the color of this image has been compromised because I've seen this image in black and white. I've seen it colorized in different places. So sometimes the colors are more vibrant, sometimes they're not. But the uniforms that you see would actually have been like a sky blue. And so the officer that we notice over on the left, right, he's very obviously in a navy blue uniform with his gold gloves and the hat and everything. And so the uniform that the rest of the soldiers are in would be this like sky blue pant and this sky blue over jacket. Um, so I don't know if any of you were wondering about that, but it's a question we get all the time. So
Alex, how do you think the artist knew what to paint here?
aha, teeing me up for our next slide. So one of the other things that's really remarkable about this particular image is that it was painted from a photograph. So these are real portraits of actual people. Whether they were just studio models or if they were actual soldiers, I don't know. But the good old internet revealed to us this photograph, which is the artist's study photo of the troops that he depicted in that recruiting poster. And this photograph has actually kind of been lost to time. The it is not like in a public repository, so it's not at the archives, it's not at the Library of Congress. A print of it was found in a garage sale, basically, by a guy named James Spina, and so he put it online at one point. And so I will credit him, courtesy of James Spina, for letting me pull this photograph from the website it was on and use it in today's PowerPoint. Um, but it's kind of interesting to think about, again, like the things that have sort of made it into the historical record and the things that have been lost or almost lost. But yeah, so the original negative of this photograph has not yet surfaced. So it's kind of remarkable that we even have this print of it at all.
That is amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think that photography was a relatively new medium at the time of the Civil War. So in this one, here we see two members of the United States colored troops with their rifles in what appears to be an active battle scene. And as we know from the technology of photography at that point, that there really aren't any Civil War battle photographs because photography relied on the subjects remaining still for a pretty significant period of time. And of course, in battle, everything's moving, it's chaos. So you could not capture, it would just be one big blurry image. So we use this photograph a lot in our teacher workshops to discuss maybe like the intention of the photographer or whoever wanted to have this photograph made. One of the reservations of arming black men and having them in the army was that, hey, they're not going to be able to, they won't be good soldiers. They won't have the ability to, learn the techniques that are required, that a really proficient soldier must master. And so possibly this photograph is dispensing that myth by showing two soldiers engaged in combat, well trained, holding their rifles the way they've been trained, firing accurately. And so this is definitely a staged photograph. Another clue that it's staged is that they're not firing their rifles because the hammers on the rifles are down, and you have to pull them back if you're actually going to fire it. So very much of a staged photograph, but probably with the intent to combat this feeling that black soldiers would not make good soldiers or could not be trusted, or would flee in battle.
So is there a date for that photograph? Was that when that was taken?
I think it was 1864, but I don't have the date on me.
It's from Dutch Gap, Virginia. If you go to the Library of Congress and you look up USCT and Dutch Gap,
And here they are again.
this is our another behind the scenes, right? Pretty cool. You can see
Yes.
the camera wagon and the box of negatives down on the edge here, and there's their prop barrel and their model soldiers standing around waiting for the next shot. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I love that because there definitely was a battle there recently. You can tell by how that the house is burned and shelled, and you can see the bullet marks in it. Um, it's also amazing that these photographs that were taken in the field survive so often because you can see where the cart is. Those wooden boxes held large glass plate negatives that were put into the camera, and they cracked all the time. And so there were obviously no paved roads. So you're driving out onto farm fields and down bumpy dirt roads, and the glass negatives are bouncing in the back of the cart, and it's remarkable that they all weren't destroyed.
The last image.
The last image. This is the fourth New York USCT, I believe, and this is a commemorative photo made of the unit, and this is soon after the war is over. So this would be a keepsake. And again, you see the soldiers. This is we saw the inset of their faces earlier, and but we see they're extremely orderly, and now they have a black sergeant in charge. They've proven themselves in battle, and they have survived the war, and they now look forward to the next step of freedom and citizenship. Um, particularly the 14th Amendment that would pass in 1868. But in speaking of the glass plate negatives, you see that line coming from the left top. That is a crack in the glass. And when it was made, when the print was made, it's taken directly from the glass negative. And so the crack shows up. And actually, the last photograph made of Abraham Lincoln also has that crack coming through his head, which many people sort of symbolized his impending death. But I think that's an interesting aspect of photography.
So Douglas meets with Lincoln a second time in the White House. And in the summer of 1863, Douglas showed up without an appointment. He just, got in line to meet with Lincoln and got to meet him. But in 1864, Lincoln actually invites Douglas to the White House because he's got a problem. It is an election year, and Lincoln is convinced he's going to lose. And so in August of 1864, the only things that Lincoln has been able to accomplish abolition of slavery wise are the Emancipation Proclamation and other smaller steps of, trying emancipation in Washington, D.C. and a couple of other things, right? Like the 13th Amendment has not been passed by Congress yet. It's probably in draft form at this point, knowing just sort of how timelines overlap and things, right? But the 13th Amendment gets passed by Congress at the end of December, beginning of January, right? Of 1865. So, August of 1864, Lincoln is convinced he's going to lose re-election. He is really worried that when he's out of office, the next administration will throw the emancipation baby out with the bathwater when he repeals the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Lincoln is really worried that the next president would be McClellan, right? And McClellan would end the war and just be like, war's over. Forget about slavery, forget about freedom, war's over, we're going to just stop fighting, right? So that was McClellan's sort of platform. And so Lincoln is really afraid that that's going to be what happens. And so he invites Douglas to the White House to collaborate on a plan that would send Douglas as like the leader of this raid, basically down into Confederate states to rally groups of folks who are still trapped in enslavement and help them escape, help them get to Union lines, help them get up to Washington, D.C. So Douglas comes to Lincoln's call here, and they meet in the White House and they come up with this plan. And Douglas, walks away from this meeting, and then he writes a letter afterwards and he submits his sort of proposal for how he is going to go with the army down into Confederate territory and gather up folks who are trapped in bondage and get them to freedom. And it's this sort of grand idea to just try and get as many people into freedom, where again they'll be protected, forever free, hopefully, before the next administration ruins it all. And at the same time, Lincoln also has his cabinet sign the blind memorandum, which is this totally wild thing when you really think about it. So on August 23rd, so just a few days after he has this meeting with Douglas, he passes around to his cabinet a memo that is sealed. And he just has his cabinet sign it, like, put your name to this, promise me you'll take care of this memo when we lose re-election. And they do. So they sign this memo without knowing what's inside it. And fortunately, and as we know, because we're in the future looking back, right? Lincoln wins re-election in 1864. And so all of this planning, all of this fear was for naught. Douglas never had to go down and rally, armies of enslaved people to seek freedom. And the blind memorandum was revealed, later in Lincoln's papers, but it never had to go into effect. But the memo said, when we lose re-election, we commit to doing everything in our power to free as many people as possible before the next administration takes office. And, at that time, elections in November, inauguration wasn't until March. So that's almost 6 months. It's 4 months, right? So today inauguration is in January. So there's a much shorter lame duck period, right? But so Lincoln was like, all right, we've got between November and March to get as many people to freedom as possible. And he has his cabinet commit to this sight unseen, which is really extraordinary. So again, like, let's think about Lincoln as somebody who's navigating conflict and compromise, right? He's wheeling and dealing with political strategy, and he's getting people to commit to strategic actions, sort of sometimes with open, transparent persuasion and sometimes not, which is really sort of extraordinary. Okay.
So here we are actually on March 4th, and this is Lincoln at the center of the photograph in front of the United States Capitol, giving his second inaugural address. So he's been, as Alex mentioned, reelected. On March 4th, he is sworn in, and this is the scene at the Capitol. There are a number of important players in the story of his presidency and assassination right within this photograph, including the man who would assassinate him. John Wilkes Booth is up there on the top row with no hat on, next to a guy with the hat on. So he's 20 feet or so away from Lincoln. And then right below Lincoln is, in a sort of what looks like a cowboy hat almost, is Lewis Powell, who was one of the conspirators who was charged with killing William Seward, the Secretary of State, and of course badly injured him in a knife attack that Seward survived. Just a few feet to Powell's left is Frederick Douglass, who's also listening to this speech. And in this speech, Lincoln sort of hints at his tone for Reconstruction and how he's going to approach the period immediately after the war. This is March 4th. The surrender would happen a month later on April 9th. So when he gives the speech, everyone knows pretty much that the war is coming to an end. And so rather than taking a punitive tone and announcing all of the things, all the people he's going to punish for starting this or rebelling against the United States, he takes a more His tone is of reconciliation, and he talks about binding up the nation's wounds and healing together and moving forward as one country. So this is his vision for Reconstruction. Sadly, 5 weeks later, he would be assassinated at Ford's Theater. Um, but the afternoon, I'm sorry, the evening of this date, March 4th, there was a large, basically a party, a reception. Um, so all the dignitaries are there. I think there was a couple thousand people. And Frederick Douglass, who we see in this photograph right here, he's he's like, hey, I'm going to the party. Lincoln invited me over to the White House. We worked on all this policy for the USCT. I'm coming. So he gets to the door, and a guard puts up his arms. He says, "You're not allowed in here." And Douglass is like, "What?" And then you hear this booming voice that says, "Here comes my friend Douglass," and it's Lincoln. So Lincoln's like, "Hey," he's publicly stating that this is my friend, Frederick Douglass. We started as sort of like adversaries. At the beginning of the war, we went through this whole process um, to sort of both arrive at our ultimate goals, maybe in different ways, but we needed each other. And now we're friends. And so it's a very sort of public declaration by Lincoln in front of this massive group of people. Again, like foreshadowing how the tone of how he would move forward as a leader. Um, and so Douglass comes up to him, and Lincoln says, "Hey, what did you think of my speech?" And Douglass apparently says, I think it was a sacred effort." So at this point, they're buddies, right? And they're complimenting each other, and they realize that they've come a long way together. In knowing that we only have 5 minutes left, and we want to be able to leave some space for questions, um, we'll end with this slide. What do you think, Alex?
Um, yeah, so in thinking about these two different leaders, their contrasting and complementary leadership styles, and thinking again about how Lincoln really navigated his political strategy throughout the course of the Civil War to deal with people who disagreed with him, find commonality where he could. Um, oh, thanks, Darren. uh, Douglass was called upon to speak about President Lincoln many times after Lincoln's assassination, but he gave a eulogy in 1865, in June of 1865. So sort of right there after it had happened. And in this eulogy, Douglass said, "It was my privilege to know Abraham Lincoln and to know him well. He was the first American president who thus rose above the prejudices of his times and country. He set me at perfect liberty to state where I differed from him as freely as where I agreed with him. From the first 5 minutes, it seemed to myself to have been acquainted with him during all my life. He was one of the most solid men I have ever met and one of the most transparent." And so I think, particularly that part where he says, he set me at perfect liberty to state where I differed from him as freely as where I agreed with him. I think that that's really sort of our final message for this presentation about enemies and friends and conflict and compromise, right? That Lincoln really did put people at ease to uh, explain themselves and put forth their ideas, whether or not they were in contrast with his own.
Hmm. Seems like a good lesson for everybody.
I agree. That's wonderful. And Darren, I agree with you too. I could listen to this all day long. I love Lincoln and I love hearing about the relationship that he and Frederick Douglass shared and uh, how their friendship and relationship grew over time. And when you think about everything that they went through together and the test of time, I mean, it's just amazing. It's amazing to me.
Yeah.
Leading a country through a civil war,
Yeah.
and just freeing a people. It's just amazing to me. thankful for that. And thank you all for sharing all of that information and those photographs and documentation of information, historical information that our teachers will be able to use in the coming years, as long as they teach. As far as I know, I would use it for sure. But is this your last presentation with us tonight?
I think so.
I think it's the last one of the year. Yep.
Oh my gosh, that's horrible. We appreciate you so much, and everything you've shared with us. And I know that our teachers, I don't mean to talk. If you have any questions, we've got a few minutes remaining. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can open your mic or you can put something in the chat. That we're totally fine with that.
Yeah.